Good morning. We look today at 1 Kings chapters 3 through 5. And Solomon has just begun reigning as king of Egypt, of Israel, but he makes a treaty with the Pharaoh of Egypt. And I had just looked down and saw Egypt, and but it says that he took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he finished his own house in the house of the Lord. So Solomon took one of Pharaoh's daughters as a wife to make a treaty, a peace pact that way, that they would live together in peace and harmony, at least for a while. And the people were sacrificing in the high places yet, and Solomon offered many sacrifices. It says that he had offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar at the high place of Gibeon. And one time when he went there, the Lord spoke to him. And he says, "Ask what I should give you." And, it's, in the Gospels, the disciples, a couple of them come to Jesus and say, "Lord, we'd like you to give us whatever we ask." And Jesus doesn't fall for that trap. But then again, Jesus asks a man, "What is it that you want?" The man born blind or lame, one or the other. But but so here, it's, God gives Solomon, ask for what you want. It could have been wealth and power and long age and whatever, but he asks, we know that, for wisdom. And Solomon says, "You've shown great and steadfast love to your servant, my father David. He walked with you in righteousness, right of heart, and you have kept him great and steadfast. And now," he says, "you have made your servant king in place of my father. And although I am only a little child," he says, "I do not know how to go out or come in." And this job is overwhelming. And he says he's a little child. Well, it's commonly kind of believed or understood that he was about 20 when he became king. But still, that's pretty young. You don't have a lot of experience. And it's got tremendous responsibility, and it's in the movie Spider-Man, we hear those words, "With great power comes great responsibility," and and I think about that phrase often. With great power comes great responsibility, and people with power, they need to remember that that they have great influence. Anyway, Solomon asks for wisdom. Verse 9, he says, "Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil, for who can govern your great people?" He understands the enormous task that is before us. And verse 10 says, "It pleased the Lord that Solomon asked for this." And he says, "I will give you a wise and discerning mind. No one like you has been nor ever will be again. And I'll give you also what you didn't ask for, riches and honor all your life. No other king shall compare to you." And Solomon is held up as one of the greatest kings. And, we have so much wisdom of Solomon, the Psalm or the Proverbs, and we have the Song of Solomon, and several of the Psalms are written by Solomon. King David wrote probably the majority of the Psalms, but Solomon wrote several of them. And it tells us in here that, Solomon sang many great songs and wrote much great literature. And so when Solomon comes back out of his dream state where he had this conversation with God, he returns to Jerusalem. And then verse 16 comes with one of the first tests of Solomon. It says, 2 prostitutes came. Women, prostitutes, what right do they have to come to the king? I can imagine the fingers wagging and, people saying, "Well, good grief, why would somebody like that? Why would the king take time for somebody like that?" They're people. They have as much right to come to God or to come to anybody as anybody else does. But these 2 women come, and, both had children, just a day apart. One died, and the mother whose child died tried to switch the child with the other woman. And, they had a dispute. And they came to King David to settle it. And think about the wisdom. Think about how did he come up with that idea of, well, let's take a sword and let's just cut the child in half and give half to each one? Well, of course, the mother isn't going to want that. And so she gladly says, give the child to the other woman. And King David then knows, because the other one said, oh, just go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, cut it in half. I mean, no mother, no father would want that for a child. So Solomon, figures out how to solve a really hard puzzle. And of course, the woman whose child had died wasn't probably happy, but the mother was happy and reunited with her child. And so that's kind of the first test that we hear and we see of Solomon's rule as king. And then in chapter 4, starts out, he says he was king over all of Israel, and then we have, throughout chapter 4, a list of a lot of names of priests and these 10 or 12 officials that provide king for the officials and everything. And in chapter 3, one of the men's name listed is Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud. And then in verse 17, there's another Jehoshaphat. And I remember watching Bugs Bunny growing up, and Yosemite Sam, yumping Jehoshaphat, he'd say. And but that phrase didn't come from either of these Jehoshaphat's. It came from, we will read later in Chronicles, I think, about King Jehoshaphat of Judah and how he stood firm. So it would have been a surprise for this King Jehoshaphat to jump. And so that's, a long story short, and who cares really? But anyway, those my mind works in strange ways, and so that phrase came up just and I think Holy Moly and G. Willikers were a couple of others that we got from Bugs Bunny and those characters. But anyway, we hear of the men that David puts into positions of governorship and helping out everyone that way. And verse 20 of chapter 4 says, Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea, and they ate and drank and were happy. And Solomon was sovereign over all of the kingdoms, from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines. And then it talks about the provisions that King Solomon needed to provide for all of these people each day, as they would. And I think about that too, the amount of the food that would be used. I mean, I just think about, how much food a cafe in one of our small towns can go through on a noonday meal, or throughout the day. It's a tremendous amount of food, and so we see some of that. And verse 29 says, God gave Solomon very great wisdom, discernment, and breadth of understanding. And then in verse 32 it says he composed 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. And he would speak of trees and cedars and all of those, and the wisdom and I mean we hear a lot of things in today's society that actually date back to King Solomon and some of his proverbs. And then in chapter 5, another alliance is made. It says King Hiram of Tyre sent his servants to Solomon, and they made a pact that way. And not only that, but King Solomon talked to him then about providing the cedar trees for building the temple. And this other king of Tyre agreed to that. And they came to a way of getting the trees, and Solomon sent men up to help harvest the trees, and they tied the trees together. They made rafts out of them and floated them across and down and around to Jerusalem, so that then they could build. And it says King Solomon conscripted forced labor out of Israel. The levy numbered 30,000 men, and he would send them 10,000 at a time for a month up to help bring these cedars home. So Solomon is beginning to prepare to build the temple the temple that David had hoped to build for God, but God said, "No, you will not be the one, King David, to build my temple." But Solomon has God's blessing to build the temple, and so we end our reading today with Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders and the Gebalites did the stone cutting and preparing the timber and the stone to build the house. And so we're getting an introduction to Solomon, and we'll read quite a bit more about Solomon and the building of the temple and how Solomon does remain faithful to God. And sometimes in today's society, it's kind of hard for a lot of people to remain faithful to God. There's so much evil in the world, and so much the devil at work. And I think about, even some of the, shows we watch that are watched on TV. I'm not going to say we, because I don't watch much TV. Games that people play. There is so much dark stuff in the world that takes people away from God, that we as Christians need to pray for the world and keep others in our prayers, that God may work through them, lead them and guide them and keep them safe from the devil.